Hello and welcome to this DSORN series webinar on vitamin D. Today's presentation, entitled The Role of the Laboratory in Assessing Concerns over Vitamin D Toxicity, is being presented by Dr. Reinhold Vieth. Dr. Vieth is an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology, as well as in the Department of Nutritional Sciences. In 2012, he received the Award for Research Excellence from the Canadian Society of Clinical Chemists. He is an expert on the clinical nutrition, pharmacology, and safety of vitamin D, with well over 100 publications on the subject. He has served as an expert advising on vitamin D-related matters for the Institutes of Medicine and the Centers for Disease Control in Washington, as well as the American Geriatric Society. Recently, he served on a committee of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences advising Health Canada on ways to modify public policy in that country in response to the new RDAs for vitamin D. He has been a principal investigator on many clinical trials involving vitamin D and maintains a deep interest in the difficulties that evidence-based medicine faces when it comes to deciding on the role of nutrients, particularly vitamin D, for the prevention of disease. With that, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Vieth.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for having me talk to you about one of my favorite topics, safety of vitamin D and the role of vitamin D with regard to toxicity. And I think one thing that clinical chemists really often have to deal with is at what point do you tell a user of your lab test that they've got a lab result that's potentially risky. Vitamin D is very interesting because, like most things, anything that actually works in your body, whether it's water, salt, sugar, protein, it may do benefit. By the same token, too much of it will be doing harm to you. And Paracelsus is the classic toxicologist, the father of toxicology to some, who came up with this concept. Because vitamin D is really quite potent, 1 milligram encompasses 40,000 units of vitamin D. People in the past have misused it. And this slide is a toxicity study. Basically, it's a form of meta-analysis from the year 1948. And the thing that I wish to draw your attention to are the doses that at that time were associated with toxicity. Toxicity of vitamin D relates largely to hypercalcemia. What hypercalcemia does, it effectively dehydrates you. Symptoms are thirst, anorexia, vomiting, etc. You can misdiagnose it, that hypercalcemia. And you need a blood test basically to confirm that it's a high serum calcium that's causing the harm. Some years ago, I was involved with an investigation, a kind of a mystery. This was initially a young man who presented in the emergency ward with the symptoms you see right here: conjunctivitis, thirst, vomiting. And when he went to emergency, initially he was dismissed as presumptive gastroenteritis. He would get better soon. Not long afterwards, however, and I guess actually the top of the slide's a giveaway here, both the son and the father were being poisoned by somebody who was somehow adding crystalline vitamin D to table sugar. Crystalline vitamin D looks very much like the crystals of sugar, so you can mix it in nicely and intoxicate people. The father's calcium, after having presented similarly, was well above the reference range. We have SI units in Canada, so you can see our reference range for calcium is up to a unit called 2.65, and this was well above it. The serum 25-hydroxy D level was 1,555 nanomoles per liter, which came as a shock, and the hormone made from vitamin D was essentially high normal, not that much going on. And no matter what unit you're looking at, this is clearly a case of vitamin D toxicity. Now, the serum calcium was even more interesting because, you know, you can measure 25-hydroxy by UV detection HPLC, and the serum level, again, in the young man when he was brought back was 1,555. Sorry, the father, but the unmetabolized vitamin D was a peak that was eluding here, something that was quite spectacular. Unmetabolized vitamin D was 17,000 nanomoles per liter, which works out to being to 6,800 nanograms per milliliter, a thorough severe toxicity. Both of the individuals eventually recovered, and you know, it was not a really long-term problem, it's an acute problem. But I want to go back just to give you more context about vitamin D. You know, like with all lab tests that we do, we have the question of what is the reference range, or what is normal for vitamin D. And again, I've done literature reviews in primates. Humans are, of course, a primate species. And if you have healthy apes and monkeys, their serum 25-hydroxy-D levels are typically higher than 80 nanomoles per liter, or that works out to 32 nanograms per milliliter. So if you had a healthy ape or monkey, you'd want your blood test result in that monkey to be higher than 32. These are, of course, box plots. The box indicates the median, and the 75th and 25th percentiles, and the whiskers indicate the highest and lowest numbers that are not statistical outliers. People who work outdoors, or who are lifeguards, or who attend suntan parlors, again, have 25-hydroxy-D levels that exceed 80 nanomoles per liter, or i.e. exceed 32 nanograms per milliliter. Some years ago, when we were setting up these methods for 25-hydroxy in our hospital lab in Toronto, 43 degrees north latitude, it's the same latitude as Omaha or Boston. Our lab personnel in wintertime had an average 25-hydroxy-D level of 40 nanomoles per liter, or 16 nanograms per milliliter. We did a clinical trial looking at different intake levels for 5 months. After 5 months on 1,000 units per day, you can see what the blood levels achieved, and on 4,000 units per day, the vitamin D produced a blood level at the far right that was not unreasonable for somebody who would have been an outdoor worker. In other words, the contention is that if you are an outdoor worker exposing a substantial portion of your skin to sunshine, you're acquiring about 4,000 units of vitamin D per day. Rickets is the classic disease, I guess, in children that relates to vitamin D deficiency, and the diagnostic threshold for vitamin D deficiency rickets is 25 nanomoles per liter, or 10 nanograms per milliliter. In the 1970s, people were really doing a lot of research, and TCB Stamp published this article in The Lancet in 1977, where they used various doses of vitamin D and had one group that was going to suntan parlors a couple of times a week. And the interesting thing was the 25-hydroxy-D blood level increased in the tanners at a rate that was the same as adults taking 250 micrograms of vitamin D per day. 250 micrograms of cholecalciferol or vitamin D is the same as 10,000 units. So in other words, if you're acquiring abundant sunshine, you're acquiring vitamin D at a rate equivalent to taking 10,000 units of vitamin D by mouth. Now remember, with regard to vitamin D, most things relate to log-dose response relationships. And classically, the reason you take vitamin D or provide it to your baby is for bone health. There are emerging issues with regard to other kinds of functions, paracrine functions, etc. But I can't go into those. Toxicity is what we're concerned with, and toxicity is much higher on the dose-response curve, as you will see. In other words, verging up to 1,000 micrograms per day, in other words, about 1 milligram per day, which is about the same as 40,000 units per day and above on a long-term basis, would make you start to worry about health with regard to the vitamin D. Incidentally, a quart of milk contains 400 international units, 100 units per cup of milk, 400 international units of vitamin D is the same as 25 nanograms per milliliter. It's not a huge amount, but this is a kind of a context issue. I want to provide more background context on serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Firstly, 25-hydroxy-D is the thing that you measure in order to assess vitamin D nutrition. Vitamin D by itself disappears out of the circulation so quickly that it's not something that we would measure as anything meaningful. And incidentally, when can you make vitamin D? Do you need wintertime sunshine, etc.? A rule of thumb is you need, according to Weatherman, a UV index of 3. And at lower altitudes, like, sea level or Boston's altitude, when your shadow is the same length as your height, the UV index is 3. And if your shadow is longer than your height, then you don't have enough ultraviolet light intensity to produce a meaningful suntan, and you don't have enough to produce a meaningful amount of vitamin D. In other words, your shadow has to be shorter than your height, and if not, you're in a vitamin D winter. Another interesting aspect about the skin and vitamin D is that, if you think about it, the natural default color of the human species, we evolved originally around Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa, and the natural color of human skin is black skin. But as people migrated northward or southward through the world, there was some selection for lighter colored skin, and it's thought that the reason for this is that lighter skin provides less natural sun protection factor. A black African from Nigeria has a built-in black skin that provides an SPF factor, sun protection factor, of about 6. So it's almost like they have a built-in suntan lotion, whereas a white person has less protection and greater ability to make vitamin D at northern latitudes. That protected adults, children, from the conditions of vitamin D deficiency. We did a survey, a couple of them, of University of Toronto students. We have a university that's probably not unlike most universities across the United States. It's quite diverse. And here you see the box plots for serum 25-hydroxy-D levels for various ethnic racial groups. The most interesting aspect is that Europeans are the outliers. They have 25-hydroxy-D levels of around 60 nanomoles per liter, which works out to about 25 nanograms per milliliter during the winter. Others have lower levels, and as I stated before, if you wanted to diagnose rickets, 25 nanomoles per liter or 10 nanograms per milliliter and below is diagnostic of rickets. So look at these non-European individuals. Easily 25% of them have 25-hydroxy-D levels that by anybody's definition should be of some severe concern. If I think about the vitamin D system, I think about body compartments and pharmacokinetics, and I just sort of want to review it for you. Think about vitamin D as entering your bloodstream, and from there it dissipates into a large volume of distribution, both muscle tissue and into adipose tissue. It disappears for a half-life of about 2 days. It's not strongly bound to vitamin D binding protein, and what's left is readily converted to 25-hydroxy vitamin D. 25-hydroxy vitamin D has, again, a relatively large volume of distribution, and its half-life is at least 2 weeks, up to about 4 weeks, depending on the study. It's very tightly bound to a specific carrier protein called vitamin D binding protein, and that vitamin D binding protein has the capacity to carry 4,300 nanomoles per liter of vitamin D. In other words, more than 40 times the amount of vitamin D as is present in the bloodstream. The kidney is an endocrine gland, and it releases 125-dihydroxy vitamin D into the bloodstream in order to help your intestines absorb calcium better. This 125-D has a half-life of about half a day, 12 hours. It's not strongly bound to vitamin D binding protein, and it's frequently given to kidney patients. Nephrologists often use the word vitamin D, but what they mean is 125-dihydroxy vitamin D when they give it. Lastly, 24-hydroxylation breaks off the cholesterol-like side chain of the vitamin D molecules, producing something called calcitroic acid that clears out into the urine eventually. So, as a laboratorian, you're always faced with reference values. You understand the reference value system for any lab test. You get apparently healthy individuals, and you take the middle 95% of that population, and their levels are what we consider reference or perhaps normal values. But for vitamin D, again, what kind of individuals are we looking at, what season, etc. So it's difficult to come up with reference values. But the one reference value that's also quite important is the toxic level, because sunshine by itself has never been implicated as causing vitamin D toxicity. But people can go to the drugstore or the health food store and buy all the vitamin D they want, at least in the United States. And then eventually, one has to risk toxicity, and the physician will want to know from you what 25-hydroxy-D level is consistent with toxicity. First thing to point out is toxicity classically for vitamin D relates to a high serum calcium caused by a high vitamin D. To a lesser extent, hypercalcemia, as I indicate here. Remember, calcium is an interesting compound because it's one of those very few compounds where the efficiency of your intestinal absorption depends on how much you're eating. If you eat a lot of calcium, you're not going to absorb it efficiently because your body only wants to absorb around 200 milligrams of calcium per day. On the other hand, if your dietary calcium is about 300 milligrams, then you're going to have quite a high efficiency of absorption to try to sustain that 200 milligrams per day number. If you eat too much calcium, of course you're sustaining your plasma calcium, and there's a relatively defined amount of calcium that goes into the urine. An adult is in calcium equilibrium. If you absorb more calcium from your food, it's going to basically end up in the urine. You don't want hypercalcemia. If you have vitamin D toxicity, it's driving intestinal calcium absorption excessively. The first sign or symptom of vitamin D toxicity is a high urine calcium, because basically the kidney functions as a spillover process for excessive calcium that was absorbed from your food. It's only once that kidney capacity is limited and overrun that you become hypercalcemic and symptomatic due to high serum calcium levels. Robert Heaney's done quite a bit of work trying to assess threshold levels for vitamin D. And he's here put together a bit of a meta-analysis of various trials, and on the y-axis you see the fractional absorption of calcium in groups at various 25-hydroxy levels. And what he's come up with is a threshold or cut point. As you take more vitamin D and as your 25-hydroxy level rises up toward 32 nanograms per milliliter, intestinal calcium absorption increases. But once you're beyond 32 nanograms per milliliter, you've satisfied the need for vitamin D to control calcium absorption, and you'd have no further changes. We did an early phase study. One reason I did more clinical trials on vitamin D is that nobody's really looked at the vitamin D system in the past as if it were a drug. And of course, when you have a drug, what you need is the phase 1 safety studies, the phase 2, what does it do type studies, and phase 3 are really does it improve disease outcomes type studies. So what you've got here is one of a couple of clinical trials that we've looked at with regard to multiple sclerosis. These individuals were active patients with multiple sclerosis, and we were looking to see whether vitamin D might do something, but here we have safety factors. Throughout this study, they were taking 1,200 milligrams elemental calcium every day. It's a worst case scenario. We're giving them a high calcium intake and then giving them high amounts of vitamin D. At the very beginning, we've got roughly a month of baseline levels. These are, again, box plots of the group's 25-hydroxy-D levels. We started on a month of calcium, and if there was no hypercalcemia or hypercalciuria, we moved on to 4,000 units per day. That's indicated there by 100 micrograms per day. If that was okay, a month later, we moved it up to 200 micrograms per day, 400 micrograms per day, and then toward the end of the study, we've got a month of 800 micrograms per day, which is 32,000 units. In the last month of the study, if they hadn't become hypercalcemic yet, 1,000 micrograms of vitamin D, 40,000 units per day for a month. So at what point? This was kind of scary work, as we were fearful that something adverse would happen. As I mentioned earlier, you know, urine calcium is the canary in the mine, the first thing that you would see go wrong if people are becoming vitamin D intoxicated. One measure that I regard as a very nice and efficient and easy measure is the ratio of calcium to creatinine. I measure these things in SI units, millimole per millimole, but American units are different. 1.0 ratio on my SI scale is equal to 0.38 milligram per milligram calcium in the urine concentration divided by creatinine in the urine concentration. It's an important number. 0.38 milligram per milligram is the point above which one would categorize the patient as having hypercalciuria. As you can see, as you go from left to right in this figure, at the bottom I show the average 25-hydroxy-D levels up to 162 nanograms per milliliter, and at the top there was no indication that urine calcium is rising in the groups of individuals, and likewise at the bottom the serum calciums didn't change either. Recognize that the protocol here was an accelerated protocol. I'm not saying here that 40,000 units or 1,000 micrograms per day was safe. We had to do this because of the long half-life of vitamin D. Remember that 25-hydroxy-D has a half-life. If you are vitamin D intoxicated, the half-life of losing vitamin D out of your body is about 2 months. By the same token, in pharmacology, in order to get to an equilibrium, you have to have a patient on a given dose for at least 4 half-lives. So we went through a rapid dose escalation study. We never reached the final threshold levels of 25D for the doses taken, but you can see nothing happened up to the levels achieved. So again, this is Robert Heaney's data. The question is there any sign that as you keep raising the 25-hydroxy-D that maybe hypercalciuria would start? We did many multiple sclerosis patients on high doses of vitamin D. And what we did was, on this graph, show the serum 25-hydroxy-D levels achieved in those patients. And the line that you see here is not a regression line, but rather a non-parametric process called a Loess plot, non-parametric linear scatter plot smoothing. So these were cut points that were not decided by me, but by the computer. Going up from low 25-hydroxy-Ds upwards. Remember, the urine calcium to creatinine ratio on the y-axis is analogous to a calcium absorption value, because that calcium you absorb does end up in the urine, and you can see that ratio I mentioned earlier here in milligram per milligram, 0.38, the magic number for hypercalciuria. Just as Robert Heaney had indicated earlier, up to about 32 nanograms per milliliter, we had a rise in calcium absorption efficiency, or urinary calcium. As we went up higher through the reference range, there was no further increase in urine calcium. And then finally, once we exceeded 100 nanograms per milliliter, there was a statistical upward tick, but not quite enough to produce hypercalciuria. There were some, of course, hypercalciuric analyses that you see, for example, at the far right top on this figure. But when those patients were repeated, their urine calciums were normal. So there's the first hint of vitamin D toxicity, not yet toxic. But if you wanted to be very conservative with regard to your lab reports, where should you start to be concerned? It would be 100 nanograms per milliliter, i.e. 250 nanomoles per liter or higher. We've done further work reviewing the literature. The previous was one of my clinical trials. This is essentially a meta-analysis where the circled figures indicate results for a group that was taking a high dose of vitamin D. The dose of vitamin D are shown on the x-axis. Here it happens to be in micrograms per day. Remember, 1,000 micrograms per day is 40,000 international units. 10 micrograms per day, the far left, is the amount we'd have in a quart of milk. The X's indicate case reports of people that were proven to have hypercalcemia together with a high serum 25-hydroxy-D blood level. What's interesting to point out here are the data at the top left of that zone. There are groups of individuals who were taking what is for some people a toxic dose, but nobody in that group, those white dots, was hypercalcemic as such. In other words, there's a bit of a gray area. Some people may be, if you want to call it that, hypersensitive to vitamin D. Some individuals with renal failure, whose kidneys cannot excrete the amount of calcium that is being absorbed from the intestine, may become hypercalcemic with excessive levels of vitamin D. Some people with a sarcoid-like condition, there are some individuals who have tuberculosis-type conditions where there is non-renal 1-hydroxylase that is inappropriately putting out the vitamin D hormone 125D, and those can also become hypercalcemic. So here I'm getting at what a lot of people regard as, the risky threshold. When it comes to dietary advice, the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute and the Institute of Medicine have a definition for the tolerable upper intake level. This is a level of nutrient intake that a healthy person could take without a doctor's supervision and be reasonably assured that there's no harm going to happen here. I consider it a safe level. Current policy for Institute of Medicine and most governments indicates that the tolerable upper intake level for vitamin D is 4,000 international units per day. And as a rule of thumb, I have, in my experience, 4,000 international units of vitamin D in the long run will raise your 25-hydroxy-D level by about 100 nanomoles per liter or 40 nanograms per milliliter. And that's, of course, the middle of a box plot with upper and lower levels around that. So again, these are the way dietitians learn their work. If you're looking for establishing a dietary recommended allowance or something, on the left you're worried about the risk of harm, things like rickets or osteomalacia, perhaps osteoporosis. And at the far right, as I indicate, anything that does good for you is going to do harm. I'm trying to figure out where's that harmful level so we can establish what's safe. So for vitamin D, from the time you're born onward, you should have at least 400 units of vitamin D. The newborn baby RDA is 400 units per day. From 1 year of age up to 70 years of age, the RDA is 600 international units of vitamin D per day. And for individuals greater than 70 years of age, the RDA, recommended dietary allowance, is 800 international units of vitamin D per day. If you wanted to poison somebody and intentionally hurt them, how would you do it? As I showed in the earlier slide of the people being intoxicated, you have to go at least 50,000 units per day. 1 or 2 days isn't going to do it. You've got to do it for many days. So a month of 50,000 units per day, I would not do. I would take it less. The no observed adverse effect level for vitamin D is in the vicinity that you could get with sunshine. In other words, 10,000 units of vitamin D per day is something that's probably not going to do you any harm, but as a policy basis, you put an uncertainty factor, a safety factor into that in what you tell the public. And so a safety factor of 2.5, 2.5 is divided into 10,000, producing an upper level, that tolerable upper level I told you about earlier. So the purpose of an RDA, remember, is to provide food advice. And what the Institute of Medicine also targets that recommended dietary allowance to be is a dose that if everybody were to be taking it, should give them a 25-hydroxy-D blood level of at least 20 nanograms per milliliter, based on at least the best research that people seem to be able to put together. That's essentially on top of the prevailing intake, etc. Now, getting back to the pharmacology of vitamin D. In the early 1970s, Barbara Marr in the United Kingdom had terminally ill patients provide permission to use their body for medical research, and what they were given was radioactive vitamin D, and then their tissues were extracted and the radioactive vitamin D was measured in those tissues. On the left you can see that, yes, per gram or per kilogram, fat takes up a fair bit of vitamin D, muscle less, but on the other hand you have more muscle tissue than fat tissue in most individuals, and on the right you can see most of the, or half of the vitamin D distributed into muscle, half of it into fat, and some into serum. So it's not true that vitamin D is inherently a fat-soluble compound. It's in muscle and fat, and you get it also in the meat that you eat, depending on how much vitamin D was provided to those animals. For example, salmon, per se, don't make vitamin D. Salmon get their vitamin D by eating microorganisms, zooplankton, near the surface of oceans. That zooplankton acquires vitamin D. Salmon eat it. You eat the salmon, and you get the vitamin D from that salmon. So it's all in the food chain. This was a nice study that was reported by Pettifor in the 1990s about a family that stole some oil. It was actually a vitamin D concentrate oil stolen by a South African family, and they used that oil for cooking. Unfortunately, they became intoxicated with vitamin D, and this is just simply to start showing the blood levels that were achieved. So on the x-axis, you see blood levels, and on the y-axis, various outcomes. That bar that I'm showing you there indicates the reference value for the analyte being shown. Okay, so you can see that, for example, the second box from the bottom, plasma calcium became toxic once they got a plasma level over 500 nanograms, above about 300 nanograms per milliliter. So you can see that the percent free 125 went up, not total, but free. Serum calcium went up, again, well over 200 nanograms per milliliter. The total 125D level hardly changed. Because 125D is a hormone, its production is relatively regulated. But one reason why the free level goes up is when you get so much vitamin D into the bloodstream, it displaces the 125 off of its carrier protein, and that free 125 is what I consider the mechanism that creates the toxicity in the end. So this is a nice little figure. You can just, if you know, above 200 nanograms per milliliter of vitamin D, it's a number that is definitely risking toxicity. So again, this is just a cartoon. I guess I put it in because I like it. Normally you have relatively small proportion of the 125 hitting the intestine. And if you've got tons of vitamin D present, much more of a proportion of 125 hits the target tissues and causes toxicity. I put it in because I thought it's pretty, but it's not helpful. So with regard to vitamin D toxicity, vitamin D binding protein has a saturable capacity. It's a large capacity. You start to produce hypercalcemia once your 25-hydroxy-Ds are over 500 nanomoles per liter. That's the same as greater than 200 nanograms per milliliters. And vitamin D system is interesting. I haven't mentioned it very much, but unlike most of the endocrine system, the vitamin D enzymes are functioning below their Km. In other words, if you put in twice the product, the system has to adapt. Otherwise, if you put in twice the substrate, the system has to adapt and produce twice the product. I'm sorry for talking so fast. It's my self-conscious nature here. It's the too much 125D in the free form that is the mechanism of harm. There are some sensitive populations, those with sarcoidosis may, most don't, but some may have the capacity to produce 125D from a non-renal site and spill it into the bloodstream. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, again, is similar, where you may have too much 125. There is a theoretical concern about thiazide diuretics because they prevent the urinary excretion of calcium, and therefore you may not have the ability of the kidney to throw out that extra calcium. Sorry for this crazy looking figure, but this is a case report of a woman who was prescribed vitamin D2 as 50,000 units to take it once a week, but unfortunately for several years, she took it once a day. Her 25-hydroxy-D level, sometimes, of course, there was serum calcium going up, and what I'm trying to show, sorry for the craziness, is the line there. That line indicates the 25-hydroxy-D blood level. I consider it a little bit inappropriate. This laboratory refused to dilute a high serum 25-hydroxy-D blood level. So for the better part of 2 years, we didn't actually know what her blood level was. We just knew that it was above 250 nanomoles per liter. But it took the better part of 2 years for the problem to resolve. I think it would have just been helpful to this lady and to the physicians if the lab had gone to the trouble of diluting it, but sometimes I guess financial things are taking priority over actually helping the customer. Treatment for vitamin D toxicity, you can see here, pamidronate is a bisphosphonate. It's a drug that prevents bone from resorbing. Prednisone is a steroid. It also antagonizes the action of vitamin D. And residronate is another it's a serum. It's an agent that reduces bone turnover. So basically, you're trying to stop bone turnover, bone resorption from happening. And of course, to keep dietary calcium to a low level to prevent too much calcium from getting into the system. At this point, what I'd like to do is summarize the gist of the talk I've just given. From the laboratory's point of view, toxicity of vitamin D requires hypercalcemia to be present along with an elevated 25-hydroxy-D. There is no proof of vitamin D toxicity unless you have hypercalcemia and perhaps to a lesser degree, hypercalciuria. The lab user, of course, wants a number for the 25-hydroxy-D level, and for that, I guess the numbers would go as follows. According to the Institutes of Medicine, you're getting your recommended dietary allowance of vitamin D if your serum 25-hydroxy-D is at least 20 nanograms per milliliter. Furthermore, 25-hydroxy levels up to 100 nanograms per milliliter are consistent with a high level of sunshine exposure, and they can be achieved without taking a vitamin D supplement. Superphysiological levels of 25-hydroxy-D can occur when you have extra supplement intakes, and this means substantially more than 4,000 units per day. If we consider further, what level of 25-hydroxy-D would you say is harmful, toxic? The paper by Pettifor that I reviewed earlier indicated that starting at around 200 nanograms per milliliter, there is clear risk of having higher urine calcium, higher serum calcium happening. So essentially, I would say at least 200 nanograms per milliliter is the toxic level, 100 nanograms per milliliter is the top of the physiological range. If the toxic level is exceeded, then basically you have to discontinue the vitamin D and avoid inappropriate doses of vitamin D intakes. The next couple of slides are more supplementary. If you really want to know more about the official line with regard to vitamin D, all you have to do is Google the words dietary reference intakes for calcium and vitamin D, and you'll come up with this National Academy of Sciences Press book. It's 460 pages of very ethical overview of the vitamin D system and the guidelines so far as dietary principles are concerned. Basically, again, they also state that the hallmark of vitamin D toxicity is hypercalcemia associated with high serum 25-hydroxy-D levels. And by that, we mean levels higher than 200 nanograms per milliliter. The Institute of Medicine numbers, you can see in their table here, table 635. And again, it's kind of a gray area, almost like dimmer lights getting turned down before you say, well, when is the level off or on? It's harmful. And according to their numbers, around 375, where 150 nanograms per milliliter would be the limit. The thing that is emerging, at least according to some individuals, is epidemiology that looks at cross-sectional surveys. And they suggest, on occasion, for some outcomes, but not most outcomes, a J-shaped or a U-shaped risk curve where there may be a statistical rise at the very highest quintile or quartile of 25D level. It's emerging, but these other J-shaped, U-shaped risks are not anything that the laboratory has to be concerned about. It's something that is still in the works, and more work needs to be done on that. But at this point, I'm happy to be open to questions and look forward to answering them. Thank you.
Does a white individual develop vitamin D resistance as a black individual after suntanning? Yeah, basically suntan is a form of building up, protection against sunshine. I think it's more a protection against, for the skin, but suntan is a sign that you are acquiring UV light and adapting to it. Not everybody tans very well. Does vitamin D levels have anything to do with fingernail health? Fingernail splitting, etc. It's an interesting question. Nobody's done trials on that, but I've heard anecdotally people talking about that. Someone has asked, how about cofactors with regard to vitamin D, like magnesium and vitamin K? Those are of help and interest. Vitamin K by itself is a compound that benefits bone and improves bone strength and reduces fractures, but not, it has not been studied a lot. You can look it up. I have one publication, a clinical trial I was involved with on vitamin K. I have how would you expect, one question says, how would I expect parathyroid hormone levels to respond to high doses of vitamin D? There's been a lot of work on that. The higher the 25-hydroxy-D level, the lower the parathyroid hormone, but it's a log relation. In other words, it takes a big jump in 25-hydroxy-D to lower PTH. I've got one longer question here from Florida. I saw a 25D level in a new patient that was 85 nanograms per milliliter. It was so odd for these patients that I got her meds list from the hospital, and behold that she's taking 50,000 for a month. Her calcium level is still okay, but I could not believe that error was not picked up before I did correct it. Yeesh, yes, I agree. As I indicated, we did have one patient that was very similar. One thing about vitamin D is, it's in some ways a good molecule because you don't have to take it every day. It has a long half-life and you can take it less often. Problem with that is people get a high dose prescription and take it daily by mistake. So you have to be very careful with the intake. It seems that someone was asking about the no observed adverse effect level, and I obviously didn't quite get those slides through. The no adverse effect level for vitamin D was not very clearly addressed by the Institute of Medicine, largely because it's an ambiguous thing. But everybody would agree that the amount of vitamin D that you get from sunshine is safe, because there's never been any indication of disease, toxicity, harm due to sunshine exposure, and that number happens to be approximately 10,000 units per day, which I would regard as the no observed adverse effect level. There's a safety factor applied to that number, about 2.5, and that's where the upper level, the 4,000 units per day number comes from. There's a question with regard to sarcoidosis and why the worst symptoms are from April to November. Might that relate to vitamin D toxicity? And I don't think so. I don't think that April, November, the months where the vitamin D is lowest, November to April, the months where vitamin D is lowest, would cause harm. I cannot answer that question well. There's a lot of questions here. I'm really, really, really sorry I can't do them all. How about vitamin D supplementation to patients with primary hyperparathyroidism? Interesting question. Primary hyperparathyroidism, that kind of tissue does not respond to feedback from vitamin D. In other words, normally there's a control, a feedback loop between the 125D that's produced as a result of parathyroid hormone and suppression of PTH. So what I'm getting at is deal with the primary hyperparathyroidism first, and then consider more vitamin D, because adding vitamin D to somebody with primary hyperparathyroidism will evoke a greater calcemic response in that scenario. Is there a recommendation for vitamin D with regard to something such as multiple sclerosis? This is a talk that deals with toxicity, and I'm not allowed to answer that one, but we do have research published in that area. So if you type into PubMed my name and multiple sclerosis, you'll see some sort of evidence or information on that area. Darn, it's so hard to answer these questions. You said that there is a capacity, sorry, this is with regard to vitamin D binding protein. You said that cholecalciferol has a capacity of 4,300 nanomoles per liter. Can you give a number for the vitamin D binding protein capacity for 25-hydroxy? That's a neat question. Vitamin D binding protein holds on to all of the forms of vitamin D. It loves 25-hydroxy-D the most, and it has less affinity for the 125-D. So it holds everything. And so if you have a lot of plain old unmetabolized vitamin D or 25-hydroxy-D, they'll both use up the sites on vitamin D binding protein, almost like a game of musical chairs where they get the DBP first, and poor old 125-D is left to sit alone, and it might then cause a bit of harm if you have saturation of D binding protein. Oh, darn, somebody said it's actually a wonderful presentation, which I'm embarrassed about. Could you provide dosages of vitamin D in terms of diabetic osteoporosis or heart problems? Again, that's not something I would be in a position to offer advice upon, and it's ongoing research. There's not been a lot of clinical trials except for osteoporosis. With regard to osteoporosis, the clinical trials have indicated benefit with 800 units per day, and the Endocrine Society recommends 1,500 to 2,000 units per day for a physician to advise a patient concerned about osteoporosis. How do UVA and UVB play into the processes of vitamin D toxicity? Again, I really love the question. The problem with vitamin D is that you've got it coming from multiple sources. From most of what you have in your body actually does come from the skin, from ultraviolet light. UVB is around 285 to 300 nanometers wavelength is the color that makes vitamin D. It breaks open the cholesterol precursor, 70-hydrocholesterol. UVA can still cause harm, and it does not make vitamin D. So, part of the problem here is you could go outside as the sun sets or as the sun's lower in the horizon or during winter. UVB disappears before UVA does. So if you've got marginal lighting, still enough to, let's say, burn your skin if you were going skiing, a lot of people comment on this, you probably still are not able to make the vitamin D if it's just UVA getting through. So it's a bit of a shady area. Can you comment on vitamin D and its connection to improving autoimmune disease? The one that I'm familiar with is multiple sclerosis, and again, that research is only in the phase 1/phase 2 clinical trial stage. There is promising evidence with regard to at least multiple sclerosis, and I might again just please take a look at PubMed and find out for yourself about these. There is nothing with regard to harm that I've noted on those. I'm just going to try taking another can drugs such as topical psoriasis treatment influence the safe levels of vitamin D in people with psoriasis? Psoriasis is really interesting because ultraviolet light makes vitamin D within the skin, and the skin is a special tissue. It has both the 25-hydroxylase and the 1-hydroxylase within it. So we know that sunshine benefits psoriasis. It makes the symptoms diminish, and it's at least partly due to the local production of 125 within that tissue. Calcipotriol is a vitamin D analog that is applied topically onto psoriasis. You're putting the final hormone 125 directly onto the skin. But they do not affect the risk of any harm with regard to taking a vitamin D supplement for the rest of your body. The topical treatments are topical, and they don't mean a lot once you get in. Does the vitamin D receptor polymorphism play any role with regard to vitamin D toxicity? It's again, an interesting question, but there is no polymorphism for the vitamin D receptor that I know of that amplifies the response to the 125. The only polymorphism or rare genetic defect that one may have with regard to VDR is an inability to sense the 125D. It's the type 2 vitamin D resistant rickets. So the polymorphisms, I would not think that they have a role to play with regard to detoxicity. Here's a question that's from St. Joseph University Hospital, Staffordshire. There are a few recent papers showing safe replenishment of low vitamin D with those patients with calcium below 3 millimoles per liter with primary hyperparathyroidism. What do I advise? Okay, so it's a good question again, because I was suggesting that in primary hyperparathyroid patients, it is not prudent to give more vitamin D. My advice is I honestly don't know, because I'm not aware of any clinical trials. I know the one study that showed that modest replacement with vitamin D didn't raise the calcium any higher. But again, my approach would be to deal with the primary hyperparathyroidism and get that dealt with, and then consider further vitamin D. I don't know if there's any upside with regard to giving vitamin D in primary hyperpara patients. I'll try another question. Nobody's stopping me yet. Do you think that 125D could indirectly be measuring magnesium at the tissue level as opposed to the 1% magnesium level in serum used clinically? No, I don't think that 125D is any kind of a surrogate with regard to magnesium. I'm not aware of it. I've always seen so much, discussion about magnesium, but when you actually try to get into the literature, there's very little that can be found about it. I'm sorry about that lack of evidence. It's often surprising how little evidence there is to the obvious kinds of questions. What should the levels of 25-hydroxy-D be in elderly patients? This is, again, a contentious issue because, at least in North America, the official number is you want 25D to be higher than 50 nanomoles per liter or above 20 nanograms per milliliter, and officially that's appropriate. However, if you look at medical decision-making groups, such as the Endocrine Society or osteoporosis groups, they quite consistently advise 25-hydroxy-Ds to be higher than 30 nanograms per milliliter or above 75 nanomoles per liter. I find it funny that thank you for doing these talks electronically. It would be difficult to attend otherwise. I'm sorry for the electric glitches, though. What would you consider the optimal 25-hydroxy-D level to be? Might it be 60 to 70 nanograms per milliliter, or 32 or even 50 nanograms per milliliter? It's a very wide range. The talk here was dealing with potential harm. As you can see, there are effectively gradations as you're going toward greater risk of toxicity. By the same token, the potential for a benefit is going through statistical shades of gray. In other words, it's extremely difficult to say at what point one has reached some sort of an optimal number. If you think about the conservative advice from the Institutes of Medicine, they say that everybody should have a 25-hydroxy above 20 nanograms per milliliter, 50 nanomoles per liter. Well, if that were the case, if 20 were at the bottom end of the bell curve, where would the average be? In other words, the top of the bell curve. It would be closer to 30 nanograms per milliliter. So even the most conservative advice, Institute of Medicine, if you take their numbers seriously, they advise that for bone health, the average individual should have a 25-hydroxy that's 30 nanograms per milliliter or 75 nanomoles per liter, which is not that far off from what advocates advise as a minimum. So don't think that you have to aim for 20, aim for 75 so that you can be sure you've got it. Don't think you have to aim for 20 nanograms per milliliter, aim for 30 nanograms per milliliter so you're sure of being above 20. I think I'm sort of running out of steam with regard to answering questions. If there's any one last one, let me know. Hello?